On that March day in 1926, I was standing in line with my 6-year-old brother, Leo, and my 3-year-old brother, Gerald, at a train station in New York City. We were waiting to board the train that was supposed to start us on our way to what had been described to us as wonderful new lives. Back then I was Alton Lou Clement. I was almost 9, and as much as I'd hated living in an orphanage, I hated taking this trip even more. Leo and I had been living in Jefferson County Orphan Home in Waterton, New York for 2 years, and Gerald had been living in a foster home. 3 other brothers and 1 sister, all in their teens, were living in other foster homes. I hadn't seen them since being admitted to the orphanage, and I didn't know where they were. Papa had struggled to keep us together after Mama died, but unemployment had forced him to separate us. Now, since I was the oldest, I'd been instructed to look after my brothers. As we moved closer to the steps, I wanted to grab them by the hands and run away, but I knew I couldn't. Instead, I reached into my coat pocket. The pink, stamped envelope with Papa's name and address on it made a crackling sound as I touched it. He'd given it to me the day before, when he'd visited the orphanage to say goodbye. "Write me when you get settled," he'd said. Then tears began running down his face. Now I proudly choked back tears as we boarded. We began threading our way down the aisle of a noisy, crowded car filled with girls in dark dresses with white pinafores and boys dressed like us in knickers, suit coats, dress shirts, and ties. A tall, thin woman with bobbed hair escorted us to our assigned seats. An excited Gerald quickly wiggled from my grasp and crawled across the seat to Leo so he could look out the window. The fierce, protective love I felt as I looked at them was quickly replaced by fear. "What's going to happen to us?" I raised my chin in defiance. "Nothing. I'll take care of us." That evening, except for an occasional cough and a muffled sobbing, the car began to quiet. I placed my coat across the back of the seat, cheered by the sight of the pink envelope sticking out of the pocket. Soon Leo and Gerald began to sag against me. I leaned back against the seat, lulled by the rhythm of the clacking wheels. As I began composing a mental letter to Papa, the whistle gave a long, mournful wail across the rushing darkness. The next thing I knew, it was morning, and the train was steaming to a stop. I was handed a brush and a damp cloth and told to tidy myself and my brothers. I washed their grimy hands and faced and brushed their hair, then reached for my coat. The envelope wasn't sticking out of the pocket. Thinking it had slipped down inside, I reached to get it. It was gone. I checked the other pocket. Nothing. "Leo, help me look on the floor. Papa's envelope is gone." He dropped to his hands and knees in front of the seat. I knelt in the aisle, trying to look under the seat. "What are you doing?" the thin woman standing above me asked. Fighting panic, I explained. "Straighten up and sit down, boys. You're starting a new life now. A clean break is best." Her matter-of-fact words weren't unkind, but when she spoke them, I knew she had taken the envelope, and all I could do was hate her. During the next 3 days, I was a numb spectator as trees and houses and towns blurred outside our window. We changed trains several times at unknown stations, then came to a stop where we got out and walked to a white church with a tall steeple. As we filed into the church, square pieces of white cloth with numbers printed on them were pinned to our clothing. Leo, Gerald, and I were numbers 25, 26, and 27. Finally, a voice said, "That's all 43 of them." Then we were instructed to go stand at the front of the church, where a lot of adults began coming in and crowding around us. I picked Gerald up and glared at the milling adults. Leo grabbed hold of my leg as a tall man dressed in overalls approached us. The man reached out and felt my arm. I stared straight ahead. "A bit scrawny," he commented, then moved on down and chose number 30. Number 30's face turned white as he left the line with the man. A smiling woman wearing a flowered dress joined them. Then they walked to a table filled with papers, where some of the caretakers were sitting. Soon other children were called out, and by the time we left that afternoon to board another train, several of the children were gone. 2 days later, my brothers and I had survived several lineups in many different towns. Each time we were inspected, I was terrified we'd be chosen, and when we weren't, I was angered and believed that people thought we weren't good enough. But I was relieved that we were still together. I'd see other brothers and sisters separated, and as I listened to their loud sobbing, I wondered, how can I stop them from separating us? On the 6th day, in a small town in Texas, with only 23 children remaining in line, my worst fear was realized. A middle-aged couple chose Gerald. As the woman reached for him, Gerald eagerly jumped into her arms. But after the paperwork was completed and they began going out the door, he looked over his new father's shoulder and screamed for his brothers. I wanted to grab Leo, run after them, throw myself down at their feet and beg them to take us. But I knew I'd be stopped as soon as I moved out of line. I'll see my little brother again, I thought, and my bitterness began to grow. I was so upset that at first I didn't notice the elderly couple standing in front of Leo and me. Then the woman placed her hand on my shoulder. We want these two. I looked up into her kind face, and as Leo and I walked out the door and climbed into their Model T, I began to hope a little. If I could stay with this couple and grow a little bigger, I could run away with Leo and find Gerald. Then we'd all go back to New York and find Papa. 3 days later, after Leo and I had just begun to settle in the large farmhouse, the thin woman who'd been with us on the train was at the door. You're going to a new home, Alton. Another nice couple wants you. My bruised heart seemed to stop beating. Why can't I stay with Leo? I had to force the words out over my tightened throat. She explained that she and her husband had decided they could care for only one child, so they had chosen the younger one. I turned and looked at Leo. His eyes were wide and frightened. I gave him a big smile and waved, I'll see you later. He seemed to accept my lie because he gave me a tiny smile as he waved back. Hours later, another elderly couple greeted me at another large farmhouse. Dusk began to settle around us as I walked around the farmyard with my newest father. He showed me several cages he'd made from scraps of wire and tin for the hen families. Then we'd wait and fasten them up. Clucking softly, each hen walked into her home, and as soon as her chicks were inside, the man slid down the cage door, explaining that he'd let them out the next morning. Soon the chicks were settled under the hens' protective wings. As I listened to their muffled cheeps and peeps, I wished for the millionth time that my mother hadn't died. The next morning I woke up, and the smell of frying bacon lifted my spirits. I could hear the couple moving around the kitchen. Deciding to surprise them, I pulled on my clothes, then sneaked out the back door. I hurried through the wet grass, which was sparkling with heavy dew, to the chicken cages. I pulled the doors open on each of the cages. The mama hens scrambled out, and their chicks followed close behind. I ran back inside the house for breakfast, thinking how pleased the couple would be with my early morning help. After breakfast, I followed them out for chores, but when we got to the chicken cages, I stared in horror. All the baby chickens were scattered around the cold grass, dead. I looked up at my new father's face. It had turned a dull red. You opened the cages, didn't you, boy? When I nodded, he told me that the chicks weren't supposed to be out until the sun had dried the dew. Later that day, he didn't speak as we buried the chicks. 4 days later, a woman was standing at the front door to take me to my third new home. This time, I didn't protest. In fact, I didn't say anything as I climbed into the car, and I didn't look back. As the car bounced over deep ruts, I made plans to run away.